then again, thank you for being here. Thank you, Agile Prague, for inviting me back once again. And always a pleasure to be here, always a pleasure to be part of this community. And for those of you who are new to the conference, you're lucky. It's a great conference, so good for you. So let me give you a bit more information about what I do, because it is relevant to what I'm about to discuss. I work independently. I'm an independent enterprise agility coach, whatever you want to call it. And the fact that I am independent is relevant because that gives me usually a certain amount of freedom in the way I think and the things I say. So I like that. And that's one thing. The other thing is that I've been doing this for a long time. And of course, I've worked with a number of IT companies. I come from IT a long time ago. But especially in the last few years, I've been working with many other different industries. So I've been working with oil and gas. I've been working with manufacturing. A few years ago, I worked briefly in pharma. So when I talk about agility, it's not necessarily agility in software development. And when I talk about organizations, can be any kind of organization. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. So title, 50 Shades. I couldn't resist the title, so it was the 50 Shades idea was, I had to use it. I'm sorry about the title. But anyway, what is Taylorism? You know who Taylor is, right? You know Winston Taylor, father of scientific management, so on and so on and so on. Okay, so that's the beginning of our story. But I want to begin our story with another story. And here I'm getting inspiration from David Wallace, an American writer. Maybe you have heard the story, or maybe you listened to this speech. He gave a wonderful commencement speech a few years ago, and you can still find the audio or the transcript on the web. And if you don't know this specific speech, just check it out. It's very inspirational and very profound. But he starts with a little parable, little storytelling. So it goes more or less like this. And there are two young fish swimming in the water, and there is an older fish that goes the other way. They encounter each other. The old fish goes, hello boys, how's the water? And the two young fish look at each other like, yeah. And they keep swimming away. And then eventually one of the young fish turns to the other and asks, what the hell is water? Okay. And that's the point, that the things that are most obvious to us, that are absolutely in our face, are the things that we tend to ignore. And that makes a lot of sense even from the evolutionary point of view. I mean, if you think about it, individuals who paid more attention to the tiger moving towards them, okay, have a better chance of survival than the individuals looking at the rock and saying, oh, there's a rock there, it's been there forever, okay? So we tend to notice more things that change rather than things that have always been there. Taylorism has always been there. Now, this sentence comes from 1974, 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, Drucker said, oh, well, Taylor did a great job in rationalizing work in factories primarily, but nothing really changed in the last 60 years after he was dead. And this was 50 years ago, okay? So 50 years ago, somebody said, nothing has changed much in the last 60 years. And what I'm assuming is that we didn't notice that many things haven't changed since Drucker. One thing that is pretty common in Taylorism and in project management in general, traditional Tayloristic project management, are two assumptions that I'm sure you're all familiar with. One assumption is, I can predict. That's one assumption that is deeply rooted into Taylorism. I want to be able to predict. I want to be able, and that made sense like 200 years ago, 100 years ago. But just to check, how many of you feel today that you think and plan in the same way you did 10 years ago? Are you planning in the same way you used to plan 10 years ago? No? Things are changing too fast, right? So we can't really predict. Okay, so that's one very common assumption. The second assumption is that I must control. That's the second assumption. Okay? I need to take care of things. And a nice quote that I heard is that one of the greatest fears of management is to lose control, but one of the greatest illusions is to have control. Okay. So we start from these very simple statements, and we'll explore what Taylorism is a little bit more. Now, please keep in mind that everything I'm going to tell you is from direct experience. It's something that I've seen working with my clients. Okay? Of course, it is an anonymous description of what I've seen. So let's start from a very, very simple example of water that's always been there. We don't even notice it. Have you ever I'm sorry, have you ever heard the term software factory? How many of you? Software factory, right? Very common term, okay. There is no such thing as a software factory, okay? If you think that software and factory can go together as concepts, you don't understand what factory is and what software is. Okay. Number one, software is not something that we must produce. We don't need to repeatedly write the same lines of code over and over. And number two, it doesn't have all the constraints of a physical product. We don't need a supply chain to write software, right? We don't need storage, we don't need inventory. Yes, sure, we need quality assurance, yeah, because it's a product. But if you think in terms of software factory, you're thinking Taylor in the wrong context. Let me give another very simple example of thinking Taylor in the wrong context. FTE, is that a term that you use here in the Czech Republic, full-time equivalent? Okay, this thing? Okay. The idea that highly skilled, highly educated people doing complex works in groups, they are fungible. You can replace one with the other and doesn't make any difference, okay? Now, full-time equivalent is an accounting concept. It was introduced just for the sake of making the numbers match between full-time employees and part-time employees. It's an accounting device. Okay. But we use that for assembling teams. I can give you 2 FTEs for UX. Okay. So that's Taylorism. Okay. Taylorism that is still there, and we just are not aware of that. Let me be more specific. This is a true story with one of my clients. Okay. There is a thing that we call dark Agile, or dark Scrum sometimes, which is when you use Agile or Scrum for the very wrong purpose, okay? Similar to the dark side of the Force, something like that, okay? And I worked briefly with a company where they installed Scrum for the very simple reason that the executive wanted to be able to decide every couple of weeks what the rest of the people should do. So they wanted reporting from the bottom, okay, every 2 weeks, and every 2 weeks this guy, who, by the way, used to run 3-hour-long meetings with 30 managers every 2 weeks so that they could decide what the other people should have been doing for the next couple of weeks. Then again, what is the purpose of this? Top-down control. So you can use Scrum in a wrong way, as Steve was mentioning earlier, wrong or right way to use Scrum. You can use Scrum the wrong way to do something which is exactly the opposite of what Agile is, but is very Tayloristic, top-down control. Information comes up, decisions are made, decisions go down. Okay? Very Tayloristic. Another one, which is very Tayloristic, but not at first sight. You need to dig a little bit deeper into this one. That's another client, and they had installed a very popular project management tool with boards and stuff like that, a task manager, whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to mention the name, okay? Very popular. But every single project was a mess in terms of how the different boards were structured. Because it goes like this. At the top, there is one big board which represents the company strategy. Now, every other board is a child of that giant board. And that describes the different streams or projects or whatever. Every person in that company works in a department, so every department have their own board, and all the activities and all the projects in that department are in separate boards, which are children of the other board, which is the children of the other board. Okay? And if you work in one function, you don't see and you don't know, for instance, if you are in product design, you don't see and you don't know what people in software development are doing, because they are on a different board. Now, why was this developed? It was done, of course, for a good reason from their perspective, financial reporting or performance auditing. Because what I can do is I can check how many hours are spent on every single issue, and have a financial reporting goes up. And so people would spend their time not to work on the product, but work on reporting their activities most of the time, and then finding very creative way to coordinate with each other, because they need coordination to do their work. That's an example of Taylorism from a financial perspective. And then the last one, because I'm just describing a problem here, then I'm also suggesting an alternative. This is more subtle. I worked with a company where the HR decided at some point that they wanted to have skill assessment surveys, which is a very good thing to do. Okay? So I want to know if, for instance, this gentleman wants to learn more about test-driven development, maybe I can arrange an internal workshop on test-driven development. So very good. I'm checking with my people, what do they need in terms of skills to do their work better. Very good. Except when they moved into the same thing for soft skills. And there was a survey which looked more or less like this one. Okay? So how would you rate your ability for empathy? That was one of the questions. Okay? How would you evaluate your stress resilience? Okay? Now, just checking with you, because maybe it's just me, I don't know, but how would you feel if somebody asked you, how do you evaluate your empathy? Depends on who you ask. Let's say that this happens in a work environment, company environment, and a manager asks you, how do you evaluate your empathy? It's a bit awkward, isn't it? It's not a right question to ask on a workplace. And let's also assume that people give you an answer. Let's also assume that I answer and I tell you, oh, I believe my empathy level is very low. What should you do next? Yeah, take a course on empathy. What are we talking about? Sorry? Oh, yeah. I got a promotion. Okay, so then again, this was well meant, but this was designed by some people who, first of all, didn't understand that our behavior is influenced by what we feel measured on. If I feel that if I come into this conference, I'm measured by my dress code, I dress differently rather than if I didn't have that information, right? That's inevitable. If you know that you're going to be valued for something, that thing will have an influence on you. Maybe small, maybe big, but it will have an influence of you. So what they're basically trying to say here is, we want you people to be like this. It's not intentional, but that's the effect. The effect is we try to standardize people at the psychological level so that they please our view of the world. Okay? Which is probably not a good thing to do, ethically and from a business perspective as well. Then, and this is Taylorism as well, from my point of view. It's an attempt of standardizing behavior. And standardizing is an important part in mass production. Okay? Then if you combine all these things, you combine segregation of information, top-down control, you combine psychological pressure, what usually emerges automatically in the organization are ivory towers. There are people who live in ivory towers, where they have more control over other people, and they become untouchable. When they become untouchable, they become impervious to change. It's very hard to introduce change in an organization where you have ivory towers. But just to be very, 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 very clear, there is no bad guy. None of this is intentional. None of this is by design. This happens just because we use a certain paradigm that was developed in a certain context, and we use it in a different context without understanding the consequences. But there is no bad guy. And that's the sad part. Okay, that's the sad part. It happens unintentionally. The almost is because I believe there is some bad guy around, but it's usually 0.1% of the population, even in organizations. But anyway, that's why there is an almost there. Now let's move to Agile. And let's talk a little bit about the waters. Remember the story at the beginning, the waters of Agile, the things that are in our face, but sometimes we ignore. Now, one thing that we tend to forget is that not only that Agile was born in the context of software development, but it was born because a very small group of people who defined themselves organizational anarchists, and this is, I can quote the article where this is written, okay? It's actually quoted there. So they defined themselves organizational anarchists that were just trying to be able to do their job well. They just wanted to be able to deliver software products well. And they realized that the organization, the Tayloristic organization, was working against that. And so they try to come up with different solutions. Okay? Very good, but you can imagine that a movement that was born, and of course it's in a, good sense, but anyway, if a movement is born with the spirit of organizational anarchists, is bound to create tension. And it's a good thing. We want to create tension constructively, okay? But it's bound to create tension. One thing we forget, however, is that production and delivery of any product is just one part of the organization. There are many other areas of the organization which think and work in completely different ways. Think of, Mirko was talking about procurement this morning, or think about legal or finance or marketing. They have a different concept of what an organization does, okay? Of course. And in fact, when we try to redesign the organization, I don't really like the term agile transformation. I never use it. It sounds a little bit arrogant to me. So I never use the term agile transformation. But some companies think that they can transform themselves, or even better, large consulting companies think that they can transform other organizations. Okay. We call this agile imposition. When somebody, now I use the term exo, which from the outside, right? Exo is from the outside, imposition from the outside. It does not mean from outside a company. It means from outside the agile mindset. When somebody who is not really into agile try to make somebody else agile, okay? And we've seen that failing a number of times. Actually, we were discussing about that not long ago. But there's another form of imposition which I believe exists, which is what I call endo-imposition, which is when the agile community tries to impose agility into other areas. Because, and again, this is well meant with the best of intentions. We try to convince marketing that it should be agile, HR should be agile, leadership should be agile, finance should be agile, procurement should be agile. And we do that with the best of intentions. Okay. With the result that we have two different paradigms that are now conflicting. The existing Tayloristic mindset, which is still there, okay, and a completely different approach. And one is trying to survive, the other one is trying to take over. And what happens is sometimes is referred to as impedance mismatch. Now, this is a term that comes from engineering, but it's also used sometimes in software engineering. For instance, when you have a object-oriented language, object-oriented model, which has to be interfaced with a relational data set. So they are two completely different paradigms, but they need to talk with each other, and so we lose power, we lose effectiveness. And that's the same thing that happens with electrical devices. That's the same thing that happens if you try to put together two completely different management paradigms. Because then again, a large part of our organizations are Tayloristic. They just don't see it because it's been there forever. It's the water that we're not aware of, but it's still there. And we try to attach Agile to it, and boom. Okay? It works sometimes. Please don't take this as a pessimistic point of view. I'm constructive. Okay? What I'm saying is, many of the problems that I have seen in organizations honestly trying to become more agile is because we underestimated the existing paradigms and just pretended that agile would make the world better like this. And sometimes we push a little too much. And then again, just to be very clear, there is no bad guy. I actually think that the Agile community has been doing a great job in the last 20 years. And I'll elaborate more on this concept in a couple of minutes. But there is no bad guy. So when I talk about endo imposition, when I talk about Agile being spread to other functions and areas in the organization, it is really well meant. I know, I've been in this community for 20 years. I know how well-meant people are in trying to make organizations and therefore people and the world a better place. I know that they do try. Okay? We can do better, that's what I'm saying. We can do even better. Now, while you ponder this last sentence, I'll get some water. Okay, so what? Because what I've been describing so far is, what I told you is, okay, listen, there are things that we usually don't want to see or are not able to see, but are there. There are new things that are very interesting. We are trying to put this together. Doesn't work all the time. Actually, most of the times it doesn't work. Okay? Or it works, but it's very painful. Okay? So what can we do? So what? This is something that I mentioned before. I honestly do believe that we in the Agile community are decades ahead compared to other organizational areas. I truly believe that. And that makes it, that's a very, very simple. I mean, the reason why Agile was invented is because we started making software an industry, right? Software had become an industry and we needed better ways to deliver software products. So that's why Agile was created. And that happened in the 90s, okay? Not, the Agile Manifesto came afterwards, but we began experimenting in the 90s, okay? Why did that happen in software and not in civil engineering? Because Agile was the first industry in the history of mankind which was based entirely on intellectual work. Okay? It was the first industry that has no constraints in terms of the physicality of the products we develop. It was greenfield. Okay? So that's why we could experiment a lot. But what we've learned is extremely valuable today to marketing, to finance, to procurement. It is extremely valuable. Okay? But they still operate on different paradigms. And we can do better in understanding each other. That's what I'm saying. I'll give you one example. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Beyond Budgeting. Some of you have heard of it. Yeah, okay. Now, what strikes me about Beyond, I've known Bjarte, which is basically who is basically the face for Beyond Budgeting. I've known Bjarte for a long time. And it always struck me the similarities between Beyond Budgeting and Agile. In his last book, This is Beyond Budgeting, he writes something like, Beyond Budgeting came from practitioner being frustrated and rebelling against organizational anarchists. Same story. People working in finance and HR who were sick and tired of running organizations in a way that is now obsolete. And they were rebelling against it. So Beyond Budgeting started for the very same reason. They say things like, a management model must enable the organization to adapt at least as fast as the environment. Adaptability, adapt as fast as the environment. This is agility, right? That's what we want to do with Agile. Adapt fast, keep the same pace as the environment. It says something like, the leadership intentions cannot survive bad management processes, which gives the opposite message. So management practices must match the value of the best leadership intentions. If your value are not matched by your processes, you're going to fail. Very, very similar to what we say in Agile, except that it is for finance and HR. And when we talk about budgeting here, we are talking about something that runs very deep into the organization. Because budgeting, I'm not talking about a project budget. I'm talking about the way an organization decides to set targets, evaluate performance, allocate resources on all levels. So it's the heartbeat, the financial heartbeat of an organization. And so what I'm trying to say is, we've been doing Agile in production, initially in software, and now we're moving Agile also to hardware production, for instance, and we're trying to do Agile in other areas. But 20 years ago, other people were saying we need different management practices, different management paradigms, because the ones we are using are old, too old for our world. So that's why I'm saying there is hope, right? Rather than pushing one against the other, when we can cooperate. So one thing that I do believe the Agile community can do better is to be a little more empathic with other organizational areas which are not really our territory. Then again, like finance or the executive level and so on, because they do have problems like we do. They do have their own problems. And they're trying to solve their problems with tools that are now obsolete. Okay? So they're not living a good life, what I'm saying. Okay? And we can try to open a dialogue with these guys. And when I say open a dialogue, it means to be curious, open, accept different perspectives, try to understand rather than trying to convince. Okay? That's what I mean by opening a dialogue. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We all want to work nicely, to do our work, and live a good life. At the end of the day, that's what we want to do. So open a space for dialogue. Second one. I mentioned the waters, right? Remember the parable at the beginning? So I said Taylorism is one of the waters that we're not really aware of. The same is true for some Agile approaches. Okay? We believe that that's the right water, okay? And which might be true, but we need to be able to observe better. That's what I'm saying. Agile is just one part of the puzzle. I do not believe that Agile is going to save the world, but I do believe that there is a lot in Agile that can save the world. And I'm talking about sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion, or just quality of life, and just better companies, and so on and so on and so on. But it's not the only piece. And the other thing, because my time is run out, the other thing is I do believe that if you really want to be agile, if you are true to your words, you should never stick to any tool or practice or framework or whatever. Okay? You don't embrace, well, a tool certainly, but any other framework. You don't embrace a framework and hold to it forever. If you do, I'm sorry, you're not really agile. If you're not constantly experimenting and evolving and trying new things and learning and changing constantly and facing new problems and taking new directions all the time because you are prepared to do that because that's the way you want to be, then you're not agile. So please try out anything you want in Agile. Try out any kind of coaching practice, a tool, a framework, whatever. Do whatever you want as an experiment. Learn from it, keep what works, or drop it immediately if you realize that it's not the right thing for you. So be agile in being agile. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay? Don't be dogmatic, ever, ever. So that's what I wanted to mention. And I'm done for today. I'm going to have an open space tomorrow, so if you want to keep talking about these issues, I'll be more than happy to. It's going to be right after the first slot of the open space. Please get in touch on LinkedIn if you're interested in keeping the conversation going, and thank you very much for your time.